20 minutes before 8 here on this Wednesday morning. According to a recent study done by the Postgraduate Professional Index, 91% of South African engineers who were participants of the studies have no faith that the government will eradicate poverty and reduce inequality by 2030. 400 engineers participated in this particular study. The National Development Plan was implemented by government on the 19th of February 2013 to eliminate poverty by 2030. But the findings of the study suggest that the government will not meet their infrastructure objectives set out in this NDP. Joining us in studio to talk a little bit about this is Motshabi Nomvethe from PPS. It's good to see you again. Thank you so much for coming in to talk about this.
Thank you, Leanne.
This particular, the index that's done, is it primarily engineers or they're professionals across all sectors?
The broader survey that PPS did do was amongst all professions. So there we spoke to medical doctors, accountants, lawyers, and obviously engineers. So that was the biggest survey that we did. And then from there, we pulled the results specifically from engineers because we wanted to track how do they feel about their profession, number one, and how they feel government is doing in terms of improving, especially infrastructure development.
Yeah.
Like you stated in your introduction, that NDP has become the buzzword. That is the framework of that government is working towards so that we can alleviate poverty and reach certain objectives by 2030. And if you look at that, a lot of the development that needs to happen there is infrastructure development. And the people who can facilitate and make sure that infrastructure development does happen are actually engineers. And that is why we actually did survey them.
Okay, so let's break that. Let's have a look at that and see what the engineers are feeling. Because at this point, I mean, just from my introduction, it seems like a very negative finding. 91% believing that this NDP goal is not going to be met. What do they attribute this to?
One of the main factors is it's a double-sided dilemma as usual. The first thing is that there is a huge concern about, one, the number of maths and science students matriculating and going into university. So as a direct result of that, we're not producing enough engineers in the first place. And if you look at government statistics as early as 2009, they were targeting to produce at least 2,500 engineers per annum.
Yeah.
And currently our universities are turning out about 1,500.
Okay.
So on an annual basis, we're speaking of a shortage of about 1,000 engineers. So that would be one of the first problems. The other problem that came out as quite a concern amongst the current engineers is that a lot of the big projects are being given to overseas companies. So that in itself is showing very little faith in the skill set that we have here at home. In that if we do have equipped people, why are we looking overseas to do that? And I think the largest part, which is probably where the biggest concern is in terms of the NDP, the plans have been put in place, but the implementation of that is not really happening at the pace, at least, that we would have expected it to happen.
Yeah, I mean, we're a few days away from 2017, and that is, that's cutting it very, very fine. And we're talking 13 years from now.
It's not that far away.
It's not far away at all. We talk infrastructure as well, and infrastructure is a very, very broad term. So when in the introduction we say that infrastructure is a big problem and that infrastructure objectives are not going to be met, what are we referring to particularly?
It's the things that we hear about. If you think of just service delivery protests, all people are asking for is basic services. That's your water, that's your sanitation, that's road infrastructure. So unless we get those very minimum things in place, and that's where the biggest infrastructure spend would need to happen. Electricity, I mean, we cannot forget about electricity and what has been happening around our electricity supply over the last few years as well. Those are that's the beginning of infrastructure development. And if you think just that in itself, how would that improve a community? How would that improve the lives of people in those communities? How would that improve people's access to employment opportunities? Because if you think, for example, in your rural areas, people can't even get around to either to the job or to a clinic on time quickly enough because either there is no road or the road is so bad that an ambulance can't get out there. So it really is very basic things that directly speak to alleviating poverty, improving people's lives, which is one of the big things that we a better life for all, but how are we improving those lives? Very, very basic services. Infrastructure, we need more hospitals to be built, we need more schools to be built. There's so many other things that we need to build. And if you think just if we don't have those basics, like I say, if we don't have a stable electricity supply, for example, it makes companies and investors shy to invest in our country. So that then directly affects the economy and how the economy works, because then if I'm not sure, how do I spend my money if I'm not sure that it can actually grow and develop in that economy? So a lot of investors, they come, they look, and they're like, maybe not now, let me give it time, let me see. And that then again has another effect on employment and opportunities for other people. So it's such a cycle, it just goes and goes in circles. And we need to find a way to curb that and to improve it, just so that everybody can really have a better life.
And we know that we have very thankfully this year dodged the junk status bullet, because we do call it a bullet because it can be a very fatal bullet to actually have to sustain. But the reality is that it's still hanging over our head. And you talk about external investment not happening now. If that happens, that we can kiss goodbye for a very long time to come.
That's very true.
Do you feel that in a way the NDP is stagnant right now? Do we see any goals moving towards that?
It's not moving fast enough. And I think we are at a point where we are getting impatient. Like you said, it started in 2013. So we're 3 years into it. And we're not moving fast enough. And I tend to worry that it might be because we think 2030 is so far away. But it isn't, because if you break down the NDP further, for example, there were goals, very specific goals in there for 2020 in terms of job creation. And then we're talking 5 million jobs by 2020. So forget 2030. And like you said, we're 3 years away from 2020. We have bled and shed jobs over the last 2-3 years. I think only the last quarter now we saw a growth of about 70,000, which is minimal in the grander scheme of things. So I think we run the risk of being complacent because we believe we have time on our side. And that is why people are getting a bit restless and a bit edgy to say, it is not too soon. We should be starting to see tangible results right now. And we should have plans in place to say what are our goals for end of next year, end of 2018, and so forth. We need to start tracking it on a more regular basis rather than waiting for 2030 to only then come back and say, oops, we actually quite didn't make our target.
That's the problem. And you know, the reality is we don't want to miss another target. We seem to always get to the targets, and then a press statement comes out saying, sorry, we've missed it, but these are the reasons why we missed it, and we leave
can't
it there.
afford that anymore.
Not with us. We can't afford it.
No.
Thank you for talking to us. Thank you so very, very much for sharing this with us. The Postgraduate Professional Index out, and 91% of South African engineers very, very worried, saying they have no faith that the government is going to meet these NDP goals by eradicating poverty and reducing inequality by 2030. Talking to us about the findings, Motshabi Nomvethe, our guest and special guest, always visiting us here at Morning Live. All right, let's take a break. We'll have more after this. Do stay tuned.